And you know what? The day I closed the door of that old house without looking back was also the day that Winnie truly began to live. To live as a complete human being, without fear, without constraints, no longer just a shadow of herself. I realized that life isn't always gentle, but it always gives us the chance to start again, whether early or late. We can live authentically with ourselves, we can forgive the past, and move forward with open eyes and an open heart. If there's one thing I hope you remember from this story, it's this: you deserve peace, love, and a beautiful life. Don't let fear or loneliness fool you into thinking there's no way out. There's always light at the end of the tunnel, and sometimes, just one brave step is enough to bring you closer to it. Thank you for listening, for taking the time to walk with me through this journey. If you felt touched, if this story brought something to you, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs encouragement, a ray of hope. A warm kiss from Grandma Winnie's heart to you. May you always be strong, always be kind to yourself, and don't forget, tomorrow can always be brighter. See you again in the next story. That helps me a lot to continue telling these stories for you. My mother always said that children have to learn through love or through pain. And in my house, I don't remember receiving kisses or hugs from her. I don't remember an I love you. What I remember are the rules that seemed normal. My mother's rules were everywhere, spoken and unspoken. Don't talk with your mouth full. Don't come in with dirty feet. Don't leave clothes lying around. But the unspoken rules were worse. Food served at exact times, clothes folded perfectly, dishes spotless. I learned that I couldn't contradict my mother. When I spilled water on the table, she would squeeze my arm hard and drag me to a corner. "Don't you ever learn, Winifred?" she'd say quietly. If I took too long making the bed, she made me kneel on the cold floor with my hands raised until I learned to be faster. If I said something she didn't like, she would grab my face so hard that my eyes would fill with tears. If I started to cry, she would sigh impatiently and say, "See, you cry over anything. You're so weak." And if someone asked about the bruises on my arms or knees, she would smile and reply, "This girl is always falling down. She's so clumsy." And everyone believed her. My mother didn't yell, didn't lose control. That was the worst part. If she yelled, maybe someone would have noticed. If she lost control, perhaps the neighbors would have heard. But my mother was always calm. Her face never changed expression. Once I dropped a plate that broke. I froze immediately. I knew she was behind me. The silence was worse than any scream. She simply took my hand, turned my palm up, and gave me a hard slap that burned instantly. Then she grabbed my fingers and squeezed so hard that I began to cry silently. "You need to learn to be more careful, Winifred," she said without any trace of anger in her voice. And I, at barely 8 years old, began to wonder, was I really so clumsy? The bruises appeared more and more frequently. One day I woke up with pain in my face, got up from bed, and went to the mirror. There was a purple mark near my left eye. I tried to remember what I had done, where I had hit myself, but the only thing that came to my mind was the night before. I was sitting at the table having dinner when my mother noticed I wasn't eating quickly enough. She leaned over, took the spoon from my hand, and hit it against my face. It was quick, discreet. My father didn't even notice. He was reading the newspaper. Afterward, my mother simply smiled and continued eating. And now, there in the mirror, I saw the result of that night. "Oh my God, Winnie," exclaimed my friend Darlene with wide eyes when she saw me at Cedar Falls Elementary School. One morning when I was 10. "What happened to your face?" My mother had trained me well in the art of lying. When anyone noticed my bruises, I had ready excuses. "I fell out of bed. I'm so clumsy. I hit myself with the door." And everyone believed these convenient lies. And I laughed too, because it was easier to laugh. It was easier to pretend it was true. But inside me, something began to change. It was that day when I began to observe the children at my school. They ran, played, jumped, climbed trees, and yes, they fell. But none of them had as many bruises as I did. None of them needed to justify their own body all the time. Why was I the only one with bruises on my arms? Why was I the only one who woke up with new marks without really having fallen? And then I began to wonder, was I really so clumsy, or was there something wrong that no one else was seeing? Cedar Falls Elementary School became my sanctuary. For those precious hours, I could breathe without calculating every movement, every word. Inside our house, my every step had to be calculated, every word measured. But at school I felt a little lighter. I wasn't an extroverted child, quite the opposite. I was quiet and shy, always observing more than talking. But there, within the classroom walls, no one demanded that I walk on tiptoes, until that particular day when everything changed. I never liked calling attention to myself. I learned early that the fewer eyes on me, the better. But that day my own teacher did something that put me at the center of attention and made me realize that maybe I didn't know how to lie as well as my mother thought. It was right after recess. We returned to the classroom and the teacher asked us to open our notebooks. I tried to hold the pencil with my right hand and felt discomfort, a slight twinge, but enough to make me frown. My hand hurt. I glanced and saw that I still had a mark, 2 purple fingers on the inside of my wrist, small but visible. The night before I had spilled a glass on the table during dinner. My mother said nothing at that moment, just shot me a look that made my stomach churn. When I finished washing the dishes, she grabbed my wrist. First, she squeezed gently, as if wanting to make sure I was paying attention. Then she squeezed hard, enough to make me hold my breath and want to pull my hand away, but I knew that if I tried it would be worse. "You have to be more attentive, Winnie." That was all she said before releasing me and returning to her tasks as if nothing had happened. Now, looking at the mark on my wrist, I knew I couldn't leave it visible. Discreetly, I pulled the sleeve of my uniform to cover the skin, trying to concentrate on the class. But then, the teacher's voice pulled me from my thoughts. "Winnie, come to the front to solve this exercise on the blackboard." My heart raced. I didn't like going up there, but I had no choice. I got up slowly and walked to the blackboard. I took the chalk with my right hand, and at that moment I felt a gaze on me, the teacher. She frowned and took a step forward. "What's wrong, dear? Does your hand hurt?" I felt the blood leave my face. Before I could respond, she put down the book and took my hand gently. She turned my wrist up, and there was the mark. 2 purple fingers. Time seemed to stop. The other children remained seated, some talking among themselves, others scribbling in their notebooks. But the teacher, she stood still for a few seconds. Her eyes fixed on the bruise on my wrist, and then she raised her head and looked at me in a way she had never looked at me before. "How did you do this to yourself?" The question seemed simple, but my whole body tensed. I knew the answer, but I couldn't say it. So I did what my mother had taught me. I lied. I hit myself with the door. The teacher blinked several times, as if trying to process my answer. "You hit yourself with the door?" she repeated without much conviction. "Yes, and it was an accident." She continued looking at me. Time seemed to drag. My heart was pounding inside my chest. I could feel the sweat forming on my palms as I waited for her response. The classroom felt smaller somehow, as if the walls were closing in around us. Would she believe me? Finally, she released my hand slowly. "Be more careful, dear." And she returned to her desk. The relief was immediate. No one else asked anything. The day continued normally, as if that little conversation had never happened. But when class ended, I packed my things as quickly as possible. I wanted to get out of there as soon as possible. I passed through the school gate and walked home to our quiet residential street with trembling legs. If the teacher had noticed, it was possible that other people might notice too. It was possible that someone else knew and simply chose not to ask. When I entered the house, my mother was waiting in the kitchen. I tried to slip past to my room, but her voice stopped me cold. "Winifred." I turned around slowly. She approached and looked directly at my face. "How was school? Everything all right?" She tilted her head, observing my expression. "Are you sure?" I swallowed. She knew. Somehow she knew that the teacher had asked. "I'm sure." My mother crossed her arms. "What did you say?" I blinked, feigning confusion. I said I hit myself with the door. She studied my face for a long moment, searching for any crack in my rehearsed lie. I had learned to meet her gaze without flinching, to control my breathing, to become the perfect little liar she had shaped me into. The silence was suffocating. Then she smiled. Very good. After that, she went back to preparing dinner as if nothing had happened. But I knew that if someday I said something else, if someday my answer wasn't what she expected, I would learn in the worst possible way. From that day on, I understood something very important. No one would ever do anything. People might ask, even look strange, but in the end, they would believe the most convenient answer. And my mother knew that better than anyone. In my house, they were everywhere, invisible, but present in every look from my mother, in every prolonged silence, in every movement that I needed to calculate before making. That's how I learned to survive. I knew that the slightest distraction could make me make a mistake, and making mistakes was never a safe option. Every day was a new challenge, a new test, and I needed to pass them all. Death changes everything. When my father died, I was 9 years old. It was a common morning like any other. I woke up, got dressed, and went down to breakfast. But as soon as I entered the kitchen, I felt something was wrong. My mother was standing in front of the sink, slowly stirring a spoon inside her coffee cup, as if hypnotized by the sound of the liquid spinning. "Mom," I called her. She didn't respond immediately, just breathed deeply, took a sip of coffee, and without looking at me said, "Your father died." It was like that, without warning, without explanation. I didn't understand. I couldn't understand. It was too early for that. My heart raced. My eyes filled with tears. What? How? She put the cup on the saucer and looked at me. Her eyes had no emotion. "He's gone, Winnie. There's nothing to be done. Now drink your coffee." I wanted to ask more. I wanted to know what had happened, why he wasn't there. But the tone of her voice was firm, with no space for discussion, and I realized that in that house, death was not a reason for tears. But I cried. I couldn't help it. Tears rolled down my face, and I sobbed, unable to contain the knot in my throat. That's when my mother hit the table with her hand, not hard, but enough to make me be quiet. She shot me a hard look and her voice came out low, cutting. "Enough, that's life, you have to accept it." She got up, took her cup, and left the kitchen without looking back, and I stayed there crying alone. In the months following my father's death, as I grew from 9 to 10 years old, my mother's control became absolute. His name was never mentioned again in our house. The house became even more suffocating. On my 10th birthday, nothing changed at home, but something shifted inside me. Pain had no space. Tears were a sign of weakness. Suffering was a nuisance. And so I grew up learning that no matter what happened, I should never cry. But without my father around, the rules became even more rigid. I always knew my mother liked control, but after my father left, that control became total. Otherwise, well, I knew I shouldn't test it. Over time, I learned that some rules didn't need to be said out loud. Each morning brought fresh challenges that tested my resolve. Those were the most dangerous moments to make mistakes. In the morning, my mother liked everything to be impeccable. The table set, coffee served at the exact time, butter spread on bread without letting crumbs fall on the plate. Once I was sleepy and distracted. I took the milk cup and accidentally hit the edge with the spoon, producing a sharp noise. I froze immediately. My mother put down her cup slowly, looked at me and simply said, "You need to learn to pay more attention," and continued drinking her coffee. But later, when I went to look for something in the kitchen cupboard, I felt her fingers grab my arm. A firm, controlled squeeze. When she released me, her fingers were still marked on my skin, and I learned. The next morning, I held the cup more carefully. Dinner was an even worse test. My mother said that being picky was for spoiled children. If I took too long to eat, I felt the tension grow around me. If I looked at the plate too much without bringing the fork to my mouth, she knew. "Open," she would tell me, taking the fork and pushing the food against my lips. The tone was low, almost affectionate, but her eyes were cold. The third rule, the most dangerous of all, was never to bother my mother after she went to sleep. It didn't matter if I was cold, if I had nightmares, or if I felt thirsty. If I woke up in the early morning, I had to stay where I was. I learned this lesson when I was 8 years old. One night I woke up scared after a bad dream. Without thinking much, I got up and went to my mother's room. I knocked softly on the door. "Mom." Before I could say anything more, the door opened suddenly. I saw her dark eyes looking at me in the darkness of the hallway. "What do you want?" Her voice was low, dangerous. I had a nightmare. She stared at me for a long time. Then she sighed, took my wrist, and pulled me inside. Her grip was stronger than necessary. She didn't yell, didn't make noise, just taught me without the need for words that I should never leave my room at night again. And I learned. The next morning, when I went down to breakfast, she was sitting at the table as if nothing had happened. She looked at me and smiled. "Did you sleep well, Winnie?" I swallowed and nodded. And from that day on, I never left my room again after she went to sleep. Months passed in this routine of silence and fear. Then, when I turned 9, everything changed. My father died. Every day was a new test. If I passed, everything remained silent. If I failed, I would pay for it. But the worst of all was that no one saw. My mother was respected on our quiet residential street. She smiled at the neighbors, made sure to keep the house spotless, spoke sweetly to the teachers at school. She was kind, polite, a strong woman raising her daughter with rigor and love. Or at least that's what everyone believed. I wondered if any adult saw something different, if someone noticed the way I never smiled too much, the way I shrank when someone spoke loudly, the way I always hesitated before answering any question, but no one ever asked. And if they had, my mother would always have had a perfect answer, because no one wants to believe that monsters can have familiar faces. At school, my behavior began to change. I avoided talking. I learned to walk slowly without calling attention. I began to lower my head whenever an adult spoke to me. Even Darlene, my best friend, noticed it. "Winnie, what's wrong? You're very different." I smiled, trying to pretend nothing was happening. "I'm just tired." And she believed me. Everyone always believed until the day I made the mistake of telling the truth. Silence has weight. I learned that from a very young age. There are things we can say, and there are things that should never be said. And in my house there were truths that couldn't leave our door. I was never a child who talked much, but after my father's death and my mother's increasing rigor, my silence became even greater. But that didn't mean I could tell the truth. In fact, I didn't even remember what it was like to tell the truth anymore. Everything happened on a common day. That morning I woke up and did everything as always. I made the bed without leaving a single wrinkle on the sheet. I brushed my teeth, counting every second in my head. I went down to the kitchen and had breakfast without making noise. My mother was quiet that day. That was usually a bad sign. If she looked directly into my eyes and smiled, it meant I had passed the previous day's test. If she said nothing, it meant something was wrong. I swallowed my last bite and got up from the table. "I'm going to school." She didn't respond, just kept stirring her coffee. I hesitated for a second, but then turned around and left. Better that way. If she wasn't talking, maybe I would have a quiet day, or at least that's what I thought. The morning at school was like any other. Classes were long, but I liked them. I liked observing the letters written on the blackboard. I liked listening to the teachers' voices explaining the content. I liked the sound of pencils scratching paper. All of that made me forget, at least for a few hours, the walls of my house. Until at recess, Darlene appeared at my side. "Winnie, did you see that dog that was at the school entrance this morning?" I shook my head. "What dog?" "A black and white stray. Very cute. It came up to me. I think it wanted food." She laughed animatedly, but then her gaze stopped on me. "You're different." I felt my heart race. Different? How? I don't know. You don't laugh like before, or talk as much. I pressed my fingers against the notebook. "I think I'm just tired." Darlene tilted her head, observing me. "It's your mom, isn't it?" My body tensed. I blinked rapidly. "What do you mean?" "I saw the bruises on your arm the other day. You always hurt yourself, but you never tell me how." She didn't say it accusingly. It was just a comment, a simple comment, but one that made my stomach churn, because she was seeing it, she was noticing it, and that scared me, because if Darlene saw, maybe others could see too. My chest tightened. I had to change the subject. But before I could say anything, another person's voice sounded behind us. Now that I had turned 10, and the bruises had become harder to hide. "Winnie, come to the front to solve this exercise on the blackboard." She smiled kindly. "Can you come here for a moment?" My heart sank. I followed the teacher to the teacher's lounge. The space was small, with some wooden chairs and a table full of stacked papers. She sat down and pointed to the chair in front of her. "Sit down, dear." My feet seemed glued to the floor, but somehow I moved. I sat down and waited. The teacher crossed her hands on the table and looked at me gently. "Winifred, I've noticed that in recent months you've been different." My throat dried up. "Different how?" She tilted her head thoughtfully. "You're quieter than before. You seem always too attentive." She smiled, trying to reassure me. "And I've noticed that you've appeared with some bruises." My head spun. "Bruises?" "Yes, some bruises on your arms and a while ago that cut on your face." I blinked rapidly. "Oh, I fell." "You fall a lot, don't you?" she said in a light tone, but there was something in her eyes. She didn't believe me. My chest felt heavy. I needed to change the subject. I needed to say anything. But before I could think, she asked the question I feared most. "Your mom, has she ever hit you, Winifred?" The air disappeared from my lungs. I swallowed. My mind screamed for me to deny it, to say that everything was a figment of my imagination. But for a second, just for a second, I wanted to tell the truth. I wanted to say everything. I wanted to say that my mother never yelled, but her silence cut deeper than any scream. I wanted to explain how I sometimes woke with unexplained aches, searching my memory for what I'd done wrong, yet finding no answers. I wanted to say that I lived in fear of her every look. I wanted to say that sometimes I wished someone knew, but then my mother's voice echoed inside my head. "You have to learn to accept." I swallowed, lowered my eyes, and when my mouth opened it was to say, "Number." The silence between us became heavy. The teacher observed me for a long time, as if looking for something in my eyes, but I couldn't let her see anything, so I simply raised my head and repeated, "My mom has never hit me." She sighed. "If you need to talk, I'm here, dear." I just nodded. She didn't completely believe me. I knew that, but I also knew she couldn't do anything without proof. So I got up, thanked her, and left the room. Darlene was waiting for me in the hallway. What did she want? I forced a smile, trying to pretend nothing was happening. Just asking about the subject matter. And she believed me. Everyone always believed. But when I returned home that afternoon, my heart was heavy in my chest, because for an instant I had almost told the truth. And I knew that if my mother found out, I would never again have the courage to say anything. The body learns to defend itself before the mind. Even before understanding what was happening to me, I had already gotten used to hunching my shoulders at the slightest sign of approach, to walking without making noise, to hiding my arms with the long sleeves of my uniform, even in the heat, and to smiling. Always smiling was the easiest way for no one to suspect anything. But what I didn't know until that day was that everybody has a limit, and mine was about to reach its. Everything started with a folded paper. That morning I was in the school courtyard waiting for the bell to ring to enter. The breeze was cold and the other students ran from side to side playing. I stayed sitting on the cement bench alone as usual. That's when Darlene approached. She said nothing, just handed me a small paper folded carefully and walked away. I waited for her to move away, looked around, and opened it. It was written in round, trembling handwriting. "If you want to talk, I'm listening. You can trust me, Darlene." I felt a strong knot in my chest, one of those that make your eyes burn, but as I was already used to it, I held back the tears. No one had ever told me I could trust them. No one had ever given me that option. I kept the paper in my pocket. I didn't say anything to her. Not that day. But inside, something began to move. At home, things were quieter than usual. My mother barely spoke to me. Her steps through the house seemed heavier, her gaze more direct. I knew she was watching me, since she noticed my conversation with the teacher. She was waiting for a mistake. And as always, I gave her exactly what she wanted. That night I dropped a spoon. The sound of metal touching the floor was like thunder inside the kitchen. She turned slowly with her eyes fixed on me. My whole body froze. "Clumsy," she said without raising her voice. "Again." I stayed still. I didn't try to justify myself. She walked toward me and took the kitchen towel from the counter with a quick movement, the same towel she had used so many times to disguise her intentions. My body shrank alone, as if every part of me knew exactly what would come. But at that moment, something different happened. For the first time, I didn't feel fear. I felt anger, not toward my mother, but toward myself. Anger for having believed for so long that I deserved that, for having swallowed every tear, every mark, every forced silence. I raised my eyes and looked directly at her. And then, with a trembling but firm voice, I said, "It was just a spoon." The silence that formed between us was louder than any scream. My mother looked at me as if I had spit fire. She wasn't used to resistance, much less to hearing my voice. "What did you say?" she asked, without changing her tone. "I just dropped a spoon," I repeated. "It doesn't mean I'm clumsy." Her hand trembled for an instant. She lowered the towel slowly. "Be careful what you say, Winnie." "I'm tired." The words came out without control. "I do everything right. I get up early, eat in silence. I clean the house, don't talk back, don't cry, and still you always find a way to say I'm the problem." My voice faltered, but I continued. "My dad would never have allowed this to happen." That's when her eyes changed. She looked at me steadily for long seconds. Then, without saying a word, she turned around and left the kitchen. She went upstairs as if I hadn't said anything, as if I didn't exist. That night I couldn't sleep. Lying in bed, with my eyes open in the darkness, I heard every step she took through the house, every door closing, every closet opening, but nothing happened. No visit to my room, no punishment, no scolding, nothing. The next day she acted as if the night before hadn't existed, and maybe for her it didn't exist. I went to school with an upset stomach. Darlene's paper was still in my pocket. At recess time I approached her slowly. She looked at me surprised. I sat next to her on the bench. We remained silent for a few seconds. Then I breathed deeply and said, "I'm not clumsy." She frowned. "I know." I turned toward her. "But everyone thinks I am." She squeezed my hand without saying more. And in that gesture, in that small, warm hand, holding mine, I knew I wasn't alone. And it was there, in that silent instant, that something inside me was freed. When I arrived home that afternoon, I found my mother sitting at the table folding clothes. I stopped at the kitchen door. She raised her eyes, but said nothing. And for the first time, I didn't say anything either. I just kept walking with my head high, firm steps, without stumbling, without dropping anything, without fear. That day I stopped being clumsy. Not every change begins with a scream. Sometimes it begins with a different silence. Not silence that hurts, that oppresses the chest and freezes the stomach, but a silence that comes lightly, almost like a warning, as if life said, "Now go." The next morning, the day after I said I wasn't clumsy, my house seemed different. But actually who was different was me. My mother remained the same. She prepared breakfast as she did every day, put the cup on the table and sat in silence, slowly stirring the spoon in the coffee. I sat in front of her. During the entire meal, she didn't say a word. I felt her watching me, expecting me to go back to being the Winnie from before. The Winnie who walked without making noise, who shrank with a look, who said, "Yes," with lowered eyes, even when her soul screamed no, only that Winnie was no longer there. And my mother felt it, because for the first time, she no longer had control over my reaction, and for someone like her, that was more terrifying than any word. The following days passed slowly. She no longer called me clumsy, but she didn't call me anything either. It was as if I had stopped existing. The silences continued to fill the rooms of the house, but now they no longer controlled me. I went to school, sat near Darlene, talked a little, ate more slowly during recess. I even began to raise my eyes when the teacher called my name. Simple things, but for me they were entire revolutions. It was a gray Wednesday when everything changed definitively. The teacher called my mother for a meeting. She didn't like being called to school. She felt as if they were trying to invade her territory. The night before, I noticed she was different. She walked through the house with harder steps. She opened and closed drawers with more force. She didn't speak to me, but I knew. She was furious, only this time, I wasn't afraid. The next morning, she took me to Cedar Falls Elementary School as usual. She didn't speak during the trip, neither did I. Upon arriving, she got out of the car with the same hard expression as always and walked toward the principal's office. I went to my class, but I couldn't concentrate. Something told me the conversation hadn't been like the previous ones, and I was right. When I returned home that day, she was in the kitchen, sitting motionless, her eyes fixed on the tablecloth. I stopped at the door. She slowly raised her eyes and said, "The teacher says you're different." I felt my throat close up. She breathed deeply. "She says you've opened up, that you have friends now, that you smile more." I remained silent. She rested her hands on the table. "I raised you to be strong, not to depend on others." My throat tensed. "I am strong." She frowned. "It doesn't seem like it. Now you live full of ideas in your head." "They're not ideas," I responded. "They're truths." The silence that followed was the heaviest that had ever existed between us. My mother looked at me as if she were seeing someone she didn't recognize, and I think at that moment she realized she no longer had power over me. That night, just after my 10th birthday, I stayed in my room awake until late. I realized then that I had two choices: continue living as her victim, or find the courage to become my own person. The decision, when it came, felt inevitable. The lamplight on, my notebook scattered on the bed, but I wasn't studying, I was thinking. I was thinking about what my life would be like from then on, about what it would be like to grow up without carrying the weight of pleasing someone who never cared about listening to me. I thought about my father, about the few glimpses that remained of him, about the way he looked at me, as if I were made of something good. And then I got up, opened my drawer, and took out my small, worn cloth suitcase. I placed some clothes, a pair of socks, my favorite notebook, and Darlene's note. I didn't cry because for the first time in my life I knew exactly what I was doing. I waited for dawn. I knew my mother would sleep deeply. She trusted too much in her own control and never imagined I would have the courage to leave. But I did. When the living room clock struck 3 in the morning, I opened the front door without making noise. The cold dawn air hit my face. I closed the door behind me, and for the first time I didn't look back. I walked to Darlene's house. She lived with her grandparents a few blocks away. I rang the doorbell once and waited. It was her grandparents who opened. Darlene was already awake. When she saw me, she understood everything with just one look. She didn't ask anything, simply pulled me inside and hugged me. A light, safe hug. A hug I had waited my whole life to receive. Darlene and her family took me in until the school contacted social services. They told my story with delicacy, listened to me, protected me. The process wasn't easy, but I was determined. I told everything without exaggerating, without screaming, without drama, just the truth. The truth I had kept inside me for so long that it had come to hurt, and for the first time someone believed me. Some months later, I was chosen by a foster family from the local Lutheran community in Cedar Falls, a modest house. And you know what? The day I closed the door of that old house without looking back was also the day that Winnie truly began to live. To live as a complete human being, without fear, without constraints, no longer just a shadow of herself. I realized that life isn't always gentle, but it always gives us the chance to start again, whether early or late. We can live authentically with ourselves, we can forgive the past, and move forward with open eyes and an open heart. If there's one thing I hope you remember from this story, it's this: you deserve peace, love, and a beautiful life. Don't let fear or loneliness fool you into thinking there's no way out. There's always light at the end of the tunnel, and sometimes, just one brave step is enough to bring you closer to it. Thank you for listening, for taking the time to walk with me through this journey. If you felt touched, if this story brought something to you, please hit like, subscribe to the channel, and share it with someone who needs encouragement, a ray of hope. A warm kiss from Grandma Winnie's heart to you. May you always be strong, always be kind to yourself, and don't forget, tomorrow can always be brighter. See you again in the next story.